Welcome back. My name is Walter Reed. In today's lesson, we will be talking about the foundational elements of any 3D platformer: player movement, camera control, jumping, and falling. So let's get started. I've already started the project with some basic building blocks, 4 walls, and a series of floating platforms. The first object we will need to create is the player object. We will need to make sure that we reset the transform so all the values are 0. Next up, we create a capsule and make it a child of the player object. We're going to make the capsule position 0 for the Y position and the player object with a value of 3. We also want to move the main camera underneath the player object. We'll add one more child to the player object. This will be the ground check. We'll set the ground check Y position to be a negative number, close to 0. We'll use this to test if the player is touching the ground. Next up, we have to create a layer for the ground. This will be attached to the floor and all the floating platforms in the scene. In the scene, all the basic functionality has been laid out. We now need to create a script called Player Movement 3D. For our Player Movement 3D script, we'll need 12 variables, both public and private. This will give our player object movement in 3 dimensions. Let's start with the variables. First, we have a public float mouse sense. This variable will determine how sensitive the camera's movement in response to the mouse is. The second variable we have is a transform camera. This variable is responsible for the camera's position and rotation in the world. X rotation is a float and represents the camera's current rotation along the x-axis. Fourth, we have the character controller. This will be responsible for movement of the object in 3 space. We have the speed, gravity, and jump height variables respectively, all of which are floats, and will be used to determine the speed and the jump height of the player object. Next, we have our ground check transform, which will detect when an object is colliding with the ground. To accompany this, we also have a float, ground distance, and a layer mask, ground mask, which will specify the distance and the layer it needs to check in order to determine collision. Lastly, we have a vector 3 and a boolean, velocity and is grounded respectively. Velocity will be used to determine the speed and direction of our player object, and is grounded will handle the player object state of being grounded. Now let's dive into the code. What the start method does is fairly simple. It sets the cursor to the lock state so it cannot leave the window. In our update method, the isGrounded variable will use the physics checker to detect collision with the ground based on the parameters specified by ground check, ground distance, and our ground mask. Once detected, if the isGround is true, the velocity's Y position value will be set to 0, so that the player object will not fall indefinitely. Next up, we will set the movement values of x and y by getting the axis from the horizontal and vertical input. The right and forward vectors will be assigned to move and multiplied by the speed. Our controller will then move the object in the world based off of the speed value. If the jump button is pressed and is grounded as true, we'll set the velocity's y position to the jump height by using the square root of -2 multiplied by gravity and jump height. This will set the initial jump velocity. The velocity's y position then continues to have gravity subtracted from it every frame, resulting in the object falling at a natural rate. The update method will then reference camera movement, which gets the mouse input value and uses them to move the camera. The mouse X value will be used to rotate the camera, and the mouse Y value is used to rotate the camera's X rotation along the X-axis. We'll use the help of mathf.clamp to help us control the angles so that we don't rotate past the set limits. Finally, we set the camera's local rotation based on the X rotation, and we set the player transform rotate based off of the vector 3 up and the mouse X. We're almost done. We just need to fix some errors that are in the code, and then we can get back to the IDE. We're back in Unity. We now need to add two components. One is the character controller. Second is the newly created script, Player Movement 3D. We need to attach the camera, the character controller, and the ground check to the script. We also need to set the ground mask to ground. and we're done. Thank you again for watching. I hope you found this useful. If you did, please consider telling me in the comments, and like and subscribe to see more videos like this in the future. Thank you, and keep playing.